This day goes and has gone by many names. It's a New Year's Day, of course. It's also, in the realm of faith, the octave of the Nativity. For that reason, too, it was, those of you who might remember, used to be called the Feast of the Circumcision of Jesus. And you still have that at the very last verse of the Gospel today, on the 8th day, on the octave. As was the custom in Judaism, still is, I believe, there is the circumcision of the child. But now, today, in the Reformed liturgy, we put our focus elsewhere on the great feast of Mary as the Mother of God. In addition, though, as you may know, it is also the World Day of Peace, and for peace, something the Church also observes. The popes traditionally issue a statement about peace on this day. So I'd like to reflect on that today, on peace. A very deep and evasive subject, and yet a very crucial one. We cannot begin this year and not realize how utterly crucial, how critical, how urgent, how profoundly necessary a message, an understanding, and a pursuit of peace are for our time, on every level, in our families, in our hearts, and especially in the world. But it has to begin with us. The most famous definition of peace, at least within Catholic thought, is the famous one of St. Augustine, who said that peace is the tranquility of order, tranquillitas ordinis, which is a good definition. It speaks about everything being in harmony, integrated, and therefore, as a result, tranquility results. And you can apply it to all these levels. Apply it first of all to ourselves, our own inner being, the harmony of all the different aspects of ourselves. So there has to be a recognition, an affirmation, an embrace and acceptance of all of ourselves, all the different levels of ourselves, body, soul, spirit, all our passions. All the aspects of ourselves have to be welcomed, received, and of course then harmonized, transformed, integrated. That's the work of asceticism and the result of mysticism, so that there can be tranquility within us. And as I say, everything starts with that. There can't be peace in the world if there's not peace in our hearts. But the same formula and the same technique needs to be applied, well, for example, in families. Each member of the family, whoever they are, has to be affirmed, welcomed, received, embraced, and then integrated and harmonized to be able to function within the family unit as a whole. And tranquility is the result. On the international level, every country must be welcomed, affirmed, embraced, and then harmonized and integrated into a greater whole, the world community today, so that tranquility will be the result. A whole homily could be given just on that. But let's go a little more further in our exploration of peace and how it can be attained and what it involves. I think we have to realize that peace involves an understanding of and a commitment to non-violence. It's not just Gandhi or even Martin Luther King. It's Jesus who presents to us a non-violent ideal. And nonviolence is a lot of work, and it's a whole technique, as you may know. But fundamentally, it's realizing that the only way we can move forward, the only way we can resemble God or follow Jesus, is if we're committed to non-violence. And we've never done that. I mean, let's face it. Christian nations and Christian people have always found ways to get around that. Once you're an empire, violence follows necessarily. So, we have to rediscover this. And it's perfectly clear in the Gospel, is it not? Do you not think I could call down 10 legions of angels right now from my Father? And yet, that's not the way. Those who pick up the sword will perish by the sword. Love your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. Pray for those who revile you. Turn the other cheek. When have we even tried to do that? But that's what it will require. A commitment to that. To realizing that nonviolence is the way forward. So what stands in the way? I mean, what makes us violent people? Well, lots of things, ambition, pride. Basically, I think it comes down to people not being accepted and affirmed, as I said earlier, for who they are, feeling worth it, feeling that they're okay as they are, that they're received, that they're worth something. And so they reach out in ambition or greed or anxiety, and often manifested, of course, as anger, as rage. Just go out on the street and you can hear it. Now what about that? Well, first of all, elementary psychology, and fitting into what I said a moment ago. The first thing is to recognize, affirm, accept, welcome, realize, take note of the emotion that's there. When rage is suppressed, rage eventually explodes. Plenty of examples of that, everywhere. So that's not the way. But also in accord with what I said earlier. Once you welcome it, it has to be transformed and integrated and harmonized. That energy must be accepted, but then transfigured, transformed. Because anger is itself and in itself is destructive when taken as such. Many will say, no, anger is very useful because you can't fight for justice without it. Well, as I say, as a beginning and impetus or momentum, perhaps. But if you carry through anger in your fight for justice, then you will poison it. You'll just bring more violence, more hatred. Love your enemies. Care about them. The Buddhists are very good at this. They remind us. But it's clear again in Jesus and clear again in the Scriptures. What does he say? You've heard it said to your ancestors, you shall not kill, and those who kill will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother is already liable to judgment. You've got to nip it in the bud. Same thing with St. Paul, who says to the Ephesians, if you're angry, okay, you're angry, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't let it fester inside you. Don't let it poison you. So anger is inescapable but very dangerous in its raw form. So what can we do about it? I mean, how do you deal with it? How do you bring this transformed into nonviolent action? And I'd like to leave you with one particular insight today that was important for me, and I think is important in itself. A lot of anger is unprocessed grief. A lot of anger is sadness that is not accepted or lived and is transformed into anger as a way of avoiding it, expressing it some other way. Depression, too, psychologists say, is both anger and sadness disguised. How many, for example, how many angry young men are there not out there in the world? In many cases, the anger comes from what I said a moment ago. They were never accepted, never encouraged, never given the opportunities, never affirmed. And so they lash out, understandably. But if they could weep over it, if they could have the vulnerability and the insight just to cry over it, to express the grief, the tears, as you know, are cathartic. They help to heal, they help to console, they help to give perspective. They allow us to be vulnerable. And from that comes compassion. When we have compassion in ourselves and our own pain, we weep for ourselves. Then in that healing mood, we are able to reach out in compassion for others' pain. And yes, want to change it, but not with anger, with love, with patience, with forgiveness, with mercy, with compassion. I think that's a real secret. To be able to grieve. We're not vulnerable enough too often for that. And yet it's so clear in our tradition, so clear once again in the gospel. The Beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn. Really? How could that be true? What does that mean? Why are those who mourn blessed? He says they will be consoled. How so? Because the mourning is already itself a purification, a healing, a balm. The mourning in itself is, in a sense, already consolation. It's already consolation. And it allows us to reach out to others in their own pain. Blessed are they who are vulnerable enough, open enough to receive their own pain, not run from it in addiction or anything else, or anger, and are able to process it with grief, with openness to God's grace, with the Spirit who cries out, Abba, Father, and transforms our inner life, as the second reading says. And then can reach out in compassion to others as peacemakers, because they've made peace, first of all, in their own being. In our ascetical tradition, especially in the Greek church, the fundamental concept of penthos, which means grief, too often taken on all levels of the church, all elements of the church, to mean simply grieving over one's sins or weeping over one's sins. It's much more than that. It's weeping over the pain of the world. Yes, the sin, the injustice on all levels, but just weeping over the sadness, the pain, the injustice. Weeping over that. It's a penthos. Taking it in. What Virgil, the Latin poet, calls the lacrimae rerum, the tears of things. Life is sad. Life is full of tears. And the closer you get to God, the more you have what the mystics call the gift of tears. You weep over the world, weep over everything. But eventually those tears can become tears of peace and tears of joy, when we realize we're in communion with God's own compassion and God's own love and God's own mercy. Because there is nobody more nonviolent than God. Have you ever noticed that? And don't talk about natural disasters. Natural disasters are just natural disasters. They're not punishments. And we weep over them too. It's the way the world is. It's an opportunity to show compassion. But God works quietly. God is so vulnerable. God doesn't force. God allows. God permits. That's part of His care, part of His gentle touch, part of His patience. And Jesus is the face of God in the world, and that's the way He lived. Nonviolent and vulnerable. So allow yourself to be vulnerable and to reach out in vulnerability to others who are vulnerable, who will not feel threatened because you yourself are vulnerable and they can be vulnerable with you. Whom does that describe? Jesus. That's the way Jesus is. He always was. And Jesus will always be. And that's who we should be in Him. And that Spirit that cries out, Abba, Father. So, if you want peace, learn how to cry. If you want to transform the world, learn to grieve and to weep over the world's pain, beginning with your own. And the anger will be transformed. The depression will be transformed. The fear will be transformed into compassion and openness and hope and the vulnerability of God Himself. That is worth a New Year's resolution. This beautiful Gregorian chant, which is a responsory, it's from Psalm 122. I rejoiced when I heard them say, "Let us go to God's house." May peace reign in your walls, in your palaces, peace.
In His